The night settled over the plains like a held breath, wide and watchful, the kind of dark that made every sound feel important. Wind brushed the grass in long, patient strokes, and the old ranch house stood against it, steady as a promise that had been tested before. He had spent his days with cattle and fence posts, with sunburned hands and quiet thoughts, believing that work could keep the past at bay. Yet when she asked him softly, "Will you be gentle at bed?" the words did not drift away with the wind. They landed, heavy and careful, and his hands began to tremble. He was known around these parts as a lone rancher, a man who spoke little and worked hard, whose boots were worn smooth by miles of dust. Folks said he carried his silence like a coat, something he never took off, even in summer. He had learned early that the land demanded respect and patience, and that feelings were best kept folded away. Nights were for rest, not for remembering, or so he told himself as he closed the barn doors and watched the sky fade from gold to blue. She had come to the ranch by chance, or so it seemed. A broken wagon wheel, a wrong turn at a dry creek, a need for shelter that could not wait. She carried herself with a quiet strength that matched the land, eyes steady, voice calm, as if she had learned to survive without asking for much. He offered a room without questions, a simple meal without talk. Hospitality was a duty out here, even for a man who preferred solitude. Days passed with shared chores and careful distance. They spoke of weather and fences, of the cattle that needed moving before the heat rose. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were chosen, never wasted. At night, the house creaked and sighed, old wood remembering other lives, other voices. He lay awake more than once, staring at the ceiling, wondering why her presence felt like a change in the wind. The ranch had seen its share of stories, though few were written down. Love had come and gone here, leaving marks as real as the scars on the corral posts. He knew those stories well because some of them were his. Long ago he had believed in closeness, in the comfort of another person's trust. He had believed that strong hands could always be gentle when they needed to be. Time had taught him otherwise, or so he thought, and he had built his life around that lesson. She noticed his hands first. Anyone who worked cattle did. They were broad and rough, shaped by rope and rein, with a quiet steadiness that could calm a nervous horse. She watched how he handled the animals, how he spoke to them low and slow, how he never rushed what did not need rushing. There was care in those hands, she could see it, and also something held back. One evening the sky broke open with stars, more than he could remember seeing in years. They sat on the porch, the boards cool beneath them, the smell of dust and grass in the air. Silence stretched, but it was not heavy. It felt earned. She asked him about the land, about how long he had been alone out here. He answered honestly, without dressing the truth up. Alone, he said, was a word with many meanings. When she asked her question, it was not loud or bold. It came the way some truths do, almost like an apology. "Will you be gentle at bed?" There was no demand in it, no promise either. Just a request shaped by trust and caution. The night seemed to lean closer, waiting. He felt his hands shake before he knew why. He folded them together, resting them on his knees, hoping she would not notice. Gentle. The word carried weight. It carried memories he had buried under work and distance. He had always believed that gentleness was something a man either had or lost. He was not sure where he stood anymore. He did not answer right away. The rancher had learned that some silences were kinder than quick replies. He looked out at the dark fields, at the fence line catching starlight, and felt the old pull between wanting and fear. He knew what people expected from a man like him, strong and steady, sure of himself. He also knew how easy it was to misunderstand strength. She waited, not pressing him. That told him more than words could. In her stillness, he felt a kind of courage he recognized, the courage to ask and to accept whatever answer came. It stirred something in him, something that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with choice. He thought of the nights he had spent alone, listening to the coyotes call, telling himself that solitude was safer. He thought of the times he had held back when he should have reached out, and the times he had reached out when he should have been careful. The land had taught him balance, but the heart did not follow rules so easily. "I try to be," he said at last, his voice low. It was not a promise. It was a truth, incomplete and honest. The words hung between them, fragile as frost. She nodded, as if she understood that gentleness was not something declared, but something proven. The porch light cast a soft glow, and for a moment the world felt smaller, closer. He could hear his own breathing, feel the pulse in his wrists. The trembling had not stopped. Inside the house, the air held the warmth of the day. The rooms were simple, built for use, not display. He had always believed that comfort came from familiarity, from knowing where everything belonged. Tonight, nothing felt certain. Every step carried weight, every pause a question. She moved with care, as if aware of the ground beneath her feet. He followed, mindful of the space between them. He did not know what the night would ask of him, or what he could give. The rancher who faced storms and stubborn cattle felt unsure in a way that surprised him. The old clock on the wall marked the hours with a steady tick, a reminder that time did not stop for doubt. He thought of the man he had been, and the man he had become. He wondered if there was room for something new, something untested. Her question echoed again, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, gentle, the word pressed against his chest, asking him to decide who he was willing to be when no one else was watching. He stood there, hands still, heart loud, knowing that whatever happened next would change more than the night. The ranch had been a place of endings for a long time. Whether it could be a beginning again was a question he had not yet answered. He walked back to the barn the next morning before the sun had fully risen, boots scuffing the frost-tipped grass. The world was quiet, except for the low groan of a gate swinging in the wind and the distant call of a hawk. He liked the early hours when everything was undecided and the day was still his to shape. It gave him space to think without having to speak, to measure his thoughts against the rhythm of the land. Today, though, his mind was heavier. Her question from the night before kept returning, curling around his thoughts like smoke. "Will you be gentle at bed?" He shook it off at first, blaming the words on fatigue or on her presence that stirred memories long buried. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a reckoning, one he had avoided for years. He fed the horses in silence, each one snorting and stamping in the cold. Their warmth and strength reminded him of the world he understood. Out here, hands mattered. Steady hands, careful hands. Yet somehow, the same hands that guided a lasso and soothed a skittish moray trembled at the thought of a question so simple, yet so weighted. He had always believed that strength came from certainty, from knowing your own limits. But this was uncertain, and it made him question more than just his skill with animals or fences. It made him question himself. The ranch itself carried history. He had inherited it from his father, who had passed before the boy had fully grown into the man he was meant to be. The land was vast and unyielding, with hills that caught the morning light like gold and streams that whispered of seasons long gone. Stories clung to the walls of the old house stories of hardship, of love, of loss. Some nights he swore he could hear echoes of laughter and arguments that had once filled the rooms. Those echoes reminded him of what had been and what had been lost. He often wondered if part of the reason he stayed so solitary was to avoid hearing those echoes too clearly, to avoid facing the man he had once been. She moved about the kitchen as he returned, humming quietly while stirring coffee in the same rhythm she had when she arrived. The sound was gentle, like a soft breeze against the side of the house. He watched her from the doorway, unsure why he felt a mixture of calm and unease. She was capable, independent, and careful everything he respected, and yet, strangely, everything that unsettled him. Out here, a woman like her was rare, not because they didn't exist, but because most avoided the remoteness, the harsh sun, the long hours with nothing but dirt and wind for company. She had chosen to be here, even for a short while, and that choice weighed on him as much as her words. Over breakfast, conversation was minimal but honest. He asked about her journey, the roads she had traveled to reach this place. She spoke of small towns and dusty trails, of nights spent under open skies where stars felt close enough to touch. There was a calm certainty in her tone that he found both enviable and alarming. She had survived, she had adapted, and yet there was vulnerability too, something she didn't hide but never flaunted. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of his own guarded nature, the walls he had built around himself. Walls that had been strong enough to keep loneliness company, yet fragile when confronted by trust. Later, he checked the fences along the western pasture, each post a witness to the years he had spent alone. The wind carried whispers of something more than weather memories, regrets, and questions he could not answer. He thought of the past loves that had walked away from him, the mistakes that had kept him solitary, and the rare times he had tried to let someone close only to have it end in quiet heartbreak. The fear of repeating those mistakes made his hands shake in ways no storm or rope could explain. She had asked for gentleness, and he realized that to be gentle, truly gentle, he had to confront the very things he had been running from for years. By afternoon, the sun had climbed high, burning away the morning frost and casting long shadows across the land. He worked on repairing a section of the barn roof, hammer in hand, muscles straining under the effort. Yet, even in the rhythm of work, his mind wandered. What did she mean by her question? Was it just a simple curiosity, or had she sensed the tremor in him before he had even noticed? He had spent his life reading cattle, horses, and storms, but this reading people was an art he had never mastered. He realized he didn't know how to read someone like her without reading too much of himself at the same time. As the day stretched, small tensions began to surface. She offered to help with the chores, and he accepted, though awkwardly. Watching her move among the animals, her hands careful, precise yet gentle, made him aware of his own rigidity. He saw in her a reflection of what could have been, what might still be if he allowed himself to loosen the grip on years of solitude. But fear remained, a quiet hum at the edges of his thoughts. Fear of failure, of giving more than he could control, of being seen in ways he wasn't prepared to be seen. Evening arrived with a fiery sunset, spilling color across the plains in a way that made the ranch feel both alive and fragile. They sat together again on the porch, neither speaking much at first. The silence was different now, not the protective silence of strangers, but the measured silence of two people navigating uncertain trust. He watched her, noting the small details, the way her eyes caught the last light, the curve of her smile when she looked at the horizon, the way her hands rested lightly on her knees. Each gesture was an unspoken message, and each message challenged him to respond without the shield of habit. She broke the silence at last, asking about the storms that sometimes swept across the plains, about how he prepared the ranch and himself for those nights when the wind could uproot even the strongest trees. He explained, detailing the fences, the barns, the stock, but not the storms he carried inside him, the ones that arrived without warning and shook his world long after the wind had died down. He wanted to tell her, to let her see the tremor inside that matched the one she had uncovered the night before, but he could not find the words. Instead, he offered only what the land taught him: patience, care, and steady hands. Night fell once more, heavier than the evening before. Stars hung low, bright against the deep black, and the air smelled of grass, wood smoke, and the lingering heat of the day. Inside, the house was quiet but not empty. The question from yesterday lingered, and he could not shake it. Gentle, he knew it was more than a request. It was a test of courage, a probe into his readiness to let someone in. And he knew that failure was not an option, though he had failed before in ways he did not dare recall. Sleep did not come easily. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hands folded but trembling still. He thought of her presence downstairs, of her quiet life moving through his home, of her trust resting lightly in his hands. He realized that gentleness was not about strength alone. It was about honesty, about the courage to be careful when the world had taught him to be hard. He had spent years learning to endure, to withstand, to survive. Now he had to learn to give, to navigate trust and vulnerability in ways that were foreign and frightening. The next morning brought the same quiet dawn, the same winds, the same fields stretching endless and waiting. But something had changed. The question hung between them still, unspoken yet omnipresent. He saw it in her eyes, in her patience, in the way she moved around the ranch. And he felt it in himself, in the pulse of hands that had been steady all his life, but now betrayed the complexity of emotion he could no longer ignore. There was a choice to be made, a path to be walked, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Not for cattle, not for fences, not for survival, but for something far harder, the possibility of connection, of gentleness, of allowing another soul to matter enough to tremble for. The days that followed were filled with small discoveries. She revealed glimpses of her own life, tales of hardship and small victories, always measured, never loud. He learned to listen, truly listen, without the distraction of routine or fear. And in that listening, he found a mirror of his own doubts, his own need for caution, his own yearning for trust. It was exhausting, terrifying, and yet invigorating in ways he had long forgotten. Each conversation, each shared chore, each silent glance became a test of will, a negotiation of hearts that neither had fully agreed to but both could not deny. Even as he worked the land, repairing fences and tending cattle, the question followed him like a shadow at midday. Gentle, not a word of command, not a word of promise, simply a word of invitation. And he realized that the tremble in his hands was not weakness but awareness. It was the body recognizing that life could demand more than endurance. It could demand tenderness, patience, and bravery in ways that the world outside the ranch would never understand. And so, the rancher moved forward, each day a careful negotiation of what he had known and what he now faced. The land remained, steadfast and indifferent in some ways, but alive with possibility in others. She remained patient, observant, a presence that challenged the quiet strength he had relied on for so long. And he, for the first time in years, understood that being gentle was not a single act, it was a choice made every moment, every glance, every touch, and every silence between them. As night fell once again, the wind shifted and carried the distant howl of a coyote. He stood on the porch, boots on worn wood, and felt the pulse of the land and the question that would not leave him. Gentle, his hands trembled as they always had, but now with purpose, with anticipation, with the uneasy thrill of knowing that life, in its quiet and unassuming way, was demanding a courage far greater than any storm he had ever faced. And the night waited, patient, for the next move, for the next answer, for the next truth that could not yet be spoken. The wind had shifted again, carrying the scent of rain from the distant hills, and the ranch felt restless under the gray sky. He moved through the fields with a sense of tension that had settled in his chest, heavier than any cattle to herd or fence to repair. The question she had asked, gentle, was no longer a simple word. It had grown into something tangible, a quiet storm that followed him through each task. Even as he mended a broken fence post, his mind raced, measuring every motion, every thought against an unseen standard. He wondered if she realized how her presence had disrupted the careful life he had built. Meanwhile, she was not idle. She moved through the ranch with ease, learning the routines without complaint, noting the subtleties of a man who rarely explained himself. She watched him with a patience born of observation, picking up on small tells, the tightness of his jaw when he thought he was alone, the way his hands trembled when he paused mid-task, the glances he gave to the horizon as if seeking answers from the land itself. There was a story there, one he did not tell, and she wanted to understand it without forcing it from him. Her curiosity was quiet, steady, like a stream carving through stone, persistent but never violent. The rancher had begun to notice the way she looked at him when he wasn't looking. He caught glimpses of her expression, thoughtful, almost questioning, and found it disconcerting. She seemed to understand something about him that he had spent decades hiding even from himself. At night, he felt the tremor in his hands not only in response to her question but also in response to her gaze, that unspoken understanding that weighed more heavily than any burden of the land. He wondered if gentleness could truly exist in a place hardened by survival, in a heart long trained to endure rather than to feel. The conflict inside him was mirrored by tension on the ranch. Cattle had begun to wander closer to the creek, straying into low, marshy ground that made their hooves sink and their movements sluggish. It was a small crisis, but in a world where one wrong step could cost time and money, it became significant. He barked orders, but his mind kept wandering back to her, to the tremble in his hands, to the question he had yet to answer fully. It was as if the land itself was testing him, pushing him to reconcile his strength with his vulnerability. She offered to help move the cattle, and he hesitated before nodding. Watching her navigate the herd was an exercise in restraint. Her hands were careful, deliberate, and yet her movements carried confidence. It struck him that her presence was changing more than his routine, it was changing his perspective. He noticed details he had ignored for years. The way her voice could calm a panicked steer, the way her eyes could detect danger before it arrived, the way her silence could speak more than words ever could. Each observation forced him to consider what it meant to let someone in, to allow care where he had only ever offered control. The evening brought another challenge. A storm rolled in over the distant hills, the sky darkening to a shade that made the horizon disappear. Thunder rumbled low and ominous, and he knew that the animals would be restless. He hurried to secure the barn doors and check the fences, his hands moving efficiently, but with an undercurrent of tension. She followed him, calm and steady, yet he could see her alertness, the way she sensed danger before it arrived. For the first time, he realized that gentleness was not separate from strength. It was entwined with awareness, patience, and courage. But acknowledging it made his hands tremble even more. Inside the house that night, the storm pressed against the walls like a living thing. Rain tapped on the roof, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. They sat near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, still trembling. She did not ask about the tremor, but he knew she noticed. Her quiet attention was a mirror he could not avoid. It forced him to face questions he had kept buried. What does it mean to be gentle when the world has demanded hardness? Can one allow themselves to trust and still survive? Could he answer her question honestly without betraying the walls he had built for decades? As the storm raged outside, he thought about the past that had shaped him. There had been women before her, yes, but each story ended with disappointment, each bond severed by fear or misunderstanding. He had learned to close himself off, to rely on the land, the animals, the routines. Vulnerability had always been a risk he could not afford. Yet she had arrived quietly, persistently, not demanding but existing in a way that called him out of his isolation. Her presence was a test, and the stakes felt higher than any cattle he had ever lost, any fence he had ever repaired. Meanwhile, small mysteries began to emerge about her. He noticed her pausing in the fields, looking at the horizon as if reading signals he could not see. She would sometimes leave early in the morning before he rose, returning with small bundles of wild herbs, or carefully tended flowers she planted near the porch. Her habits suggested a life lived with care and intention, yet she offered no explanations. He found himself curious, even anxious about her past. Who was she really? Why did she choose to come here, to a place so far removed from ordinary life? Each unanswered question added weight to the tension, each observation a thread pulling him toward a reckoning he could not yet name. Conflict was not only internal. The land reminded him of practical dangers too. The creek was rising from the storm, threatening low-lying pastures. Cattle needed moving before they became trapped, fences needed repair to withstand the wind, and the barn doors required reinforcement. He barked orders to himself as much as to her, pacing, checking, and recalculating. But in the pauses between tasks, he felt the tremble return, a reminder that the real challenge was not weather or livestock, but the unseen force between them. She seemed aware of his tension, but never pressed him. Instead, she offered small gestures of trust, a hand resting lightly on a stall door, a careful look when he handled the cattle, a willingness to learn his routines without disrupting them. Each act was subtle but deliberate, challenging him to respond not with avoidance but with thoughtfulness. He realized that gentleness, the word she had spoken, was not a single act. It was an accumulation of choices, each one requiring courage, patience, and self-awareness. Even at night, the tension did not ease. They both lay awake, listening to the storm, each lost in their own thoughts yet aware of the other. The rancher replayed her question over and over, testing different responses, weighing the consequences of each. He knew he could not avoid it forever, yet he also feared that any misstep would undo the fragile connection forming between them. The unspoken understanding between them had created a space where honesty was demanded, yet he was unprepared to be that honest. Meanwhile, she wondered at him too. She had seen men like him before, strong, quiet, capable, but few had the depth she sensed here. She recognized the tremble not as weakness but as an opening, a signal that beneath the surface of control lay complexity, fear, and desire. She did not push, but her observation added pressure, forcing him to confront emotions he had avoided for years. Her patience was a challenge, a quiet insistence that he respond to life, not just survive it. The storm passed eventually, leaving a landscape glistening with rain and the smell of wet earth. The rancher walked through the fields, boots sinking into softened soil, hands still trembling. The conflict within him had deepened. He knew he could no longer hide behind routines or isolation. He understood that being gentle, in the way she had asked, meant more than skill with cattle or care with fences. It meant facing the vulnerability he had spent decades denying. Yet he did not know if he could rise to the challenge. Even as the day returned, calm and bright, the tension lingered. Every glance, every gesture, every silence between them carried unspoken weight. The land, the storm, and the cattle demanded attention, but so did the uncharted territory of trust, care, and human connection. The rancher realized that the hardest task before him was not to survive another day alone, but to navigate the possibilities that her presence had brought, to decide whether he would remain a man of habits and walls, or attempt the delicate act of gentleness. And so, life continued on the ranch, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. The fields stretched into the horizon, the cattle grazed, the fences stood firm, yet an invisible line had been crossed, and neither of them could ignore it. The questions she had asked, soft and careful, remained unanswered, and with each passing day, it gained urgency, gentle. It was more than a word, it was a test, a challenge, a door. And he stood before it, aware that opening it or choosing not to would shape more than the night ahead. As dusk fell once more, the rancher paused on the porch, looking at the fields, the rising creek, and the fading sunlight. He could feel the tremor in his hands, stronger now, not from cold or fatigue, but from knowing that the real work was only beginning. The storm had passed, but the reckoning remained. And somewhere in the quiet he sensed that, whatever choice he made next, the land and the woman would be watching, patient and unwavering, waiting to see if he could face not just the world outside, but the storm within. The sun rose slowly over the plains, casting long, golden fingers across the fields, but the warmth of light did little to soothe the tension in the old ranch house. He moved quietly, boots heavy against the floorboards, feeling every creak, every sound as though it were part of some hidden conversation. The storm from the night before had left the land slick and fragrant, the air sharp with wet grass and churned soil. Yet no matter how real the world outside was, the storm inside him, the tremor, the unease, the question she had asked remained, gentle, the word weighed on him, persistent and precise, demanding an answer he was still afraid to give. She joined him at dawn, a bundle of blankets in her hands, moving with that calm certainty that unsettled him more than any chaos of the weather. She did not speak immediately, simply watched him as he prepared coffee and fed the horses. There was a quiet strength in her patience, a presence that refused to be ignored, and he felt the pull of it even as he tried to focus on chores. Every glance she gave him, every gesture that seemed ordinary on the surface, carried meaning. It reminded him that the question from the night before had not been a one-time thing. It was a challenge, a test, a door he could no longer avoid. As the day stretched, tension built like the slow tightening of a rope. The cattle had been restless since the storm, moving too close to the creek, the low ground soft with rain. He worked alongside her, watching her hands steady the herd, noticing the way she read the animals with a patience he recognized as skill and instinct combined. It made him both anxious and fascinated. He could manage the land, the fences, the cattle, but this, her presence, her quiet insistence, was something new, something unpredictable. The idea of being gentle, truly gentle, became more than a word. It became a measure of character, a test of courage he hadn't faced in years. By midday, the ranch demanded attention. One of the younger cows had wandered into the marsh, and he realized the danger before it could escalate. The ground was slippery, the mud deep, and the animal struggled, panicking as he approached. She moved beside him without hesitation, guiding the cow with soft words and careful hands. He observed her closely, heart racing, aware of how her courage made his own uncertainty more visible. He wanted to act, to show strength, to solve the problem quickly, but he hesitated, realizing that part of the challenge was not just managing the animal, but learning to balance care with control, gentleness with authority. The afternoon sun burned low, casting long shadows across the barnyard. He repaired the damaged fence as she handed him tools, each movement deliberate, measured, the space between them charged with an unspoken dialogue. His hands trembled, not from labor alone, but from the weight of unspoken feelings, from the fear of failing the silent test she had set. He had never allowed himself to feel this way, never let uncertainty mingle with responsibility, and it made every motion deliberate, cautious, and yet full of anticipation. As the evening approached, clouds gathered again, threatening another storm. He watched the horizon carefully, noticing the way the wind shifted, the way the grass bent under invisible pressure. She had taken to helping with the chores without complaint, her presence steadying the chaos, yet also highlighting the tremor in him that he could no longer hide. It became clear that the real storm was not outside, but inside, the storm of trust, of fear, of anticipation, and of the unspoken possibility between them. Night fell like a velvet curtain, thick and pressing. The porch was cool underfoot, the air filled with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. They sat together, close enough that he could feel the quiet energy radiating from her, yet distant enough to keep control. He was aware of his own hands, trembling more noticeably now, the weight of decision and emotion settling heavily upon him. The land around them was silent, expectant, as if even the animals knew that something was unfolding that went beyond routine or survival. She broke the silence finally, not with questions but with observation. She spoke of the cattle, the land, the weather, and then paused, her eyes searching his. He could feel her awareness, her understanding that the real challenge was not in the tasks they performed, but in the quiet test of human connection that neither had faced before. The tremor in his hands was a mirror of the storm in his chest, a rhythm he could not control, a signal that the moment for confrontation was near. Later, inside the house, he moved through the rooms with deliberate slowness, aware of her presence, aware of the small changes in her behavior, how she noticed the subtle creaks in the floor, the uneven boards in the walls, the worn places in the furniture. Each observation was gentle, precise, and intentional, and it reminded him again that gentleness was not a single act but a series of choices, each one weighted with consequence. He felt the weight of every choice he had avoided making in his life, the walls he had built around his heart, and the risk he would take if he allowed them to be torn down. The fire crackled in the fireplace, shadows flickering across the room, and he felt the tension reach a new peak. The tremor in his hands had not eased, yet he understood that it was no longer fear alone. It was anticipation, awareness, and a recognition that the life he had built around distance and solitude could no longer contain the pull of possibility. He thought of the words she had spoken, the quiet challenge they represented, and he realized that every fiber of his being was now engaged in a test he could not avoid. Meanwhile, she too felt the tension tightening like a rope between them. She had seen the tremor, recognized the restraint, and understood the walls he had built. Yet her patience remained unbroken, a gentle insistence that he respond not just to the world outside, but to the reality of human connection. She observed the subtleties, the way he moved, the glances he cast, the hesitation in his speech, and she understood that the moment for honesty, for choice, was approaching. And she waited, not with impatience, but with the quiet force of inevitability. The night deepened, and with it the suspense. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a reminder that the storm was never truly gone. Outside, the land was alive with the whispers of wind, the scent of rain, and the promise of change. Inside, the house held its own tension, a silent dialogue between two people whose lives had been interrupted by trust, presence, and an unspoken challenge. He felt the tremor growing stronger, the awareness sharper, the anticipation almost unbearable. The question lingered in the air, waiting to be answered, waiting to define the course of what was to come. The next day, the conflict intensified. Tasks on the ranch required coordination, trust, and teamwork. They moved cattle together, repaired fences, and prepared for the next storm, yet every motion was underscored by the tension of unspoken possibilities. He noticed her watching him closely, noting the way he held himself, the way he moved, the careful deliberation of each step. He felt exposed, more than he had ever felt with any visitor, any companion, any stranger. Her presence was a mirror, and the reflection it showed was both terrifying and exhilarating. By evening, the rancher could no longer ignore the truth. The tremor in his hands had become a constant companion, a reminder of what was at stake. Every glance, every gesture, every silence between them was now infused with meaning. The land demanded attention, but so did the uncharted territory of trust, care, and human connection. Each unspoken question, Each careful observation, each small act of gentleness or hesitation became part of the unfolding climax, the moment when everything they had navigated together might finally collide with the truth. The sky darkened again, and he stood on the porch, boots on worn wood, looking at the horizon. He felt the tremor in his hands, the tension in his chest, and the weight of every choice he had delayed. She emerged from the house quietly, her presence as steady and intentional as the land itself, and they stood together, side by side, aware that the moment for confrontation, the moment when words, gestures, and actions would have to meet was near. The storm approached, distant but insistent, and the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain, the weight of the land, and the unspoken challenge between them. Gentle, the word echoed in his mind, no longer a simple request but a test of courage, patience, and trust. The night waited, heavy with anticipation, and the rancher realized that the climax, the tipping point, was upon them. The choice he made next would shape not only the night ahead, but the life they could build together. He looked at her as she looked back, both aware of the tension, the tremor, the unspoken understanding. Every instinct told him to retreat into familiarity, into the safety of solitude and routine. Yet every impulse, every heartbeat, urged him to step forward, to embrace the unknown, to allow the possibility of connection, of gentleness, of something deeper than survival. The air between them was charged, the land around them silent, and the storm waiting. And in that suspended moment, as the wind picked up and the first drops of rain fell on the dry earth, the rancher understood that the climax, the moment of truth, was just ahead. The tremor in his hands was no longer just fear. It was the pulse of anticipation, the warning and the invitation, the measure of courage he had been avoiding for years. The night, the storm, and the woman beside him demanded a response, gentle, and he knew that what happened next would decide not only the fate of the ranch but the possibility of happiness he had long denied himself. The first drops of rain hit the porch, gentle at first, then heavier, drumming softly against the roof. The rancher stood beside her, the tremor in his hands still there, but now tinged with anticipation instead of fear. He had spent decades managing the land, guiding cattle, repairing fences, surviving storms, but nothing had tested him like this, the quiet storm of trust and connection that had grown between them. The question she had asked so long ago, gentle, no longer hovered as a challenge. It had become a pathway, a choice, and he realized that he could meet it if he allowed himself to. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the gray sky and the first flickers of firelight from inside the house. Her expression was calm, patient, and somehow knowing. He swallowed the tightness in his chest and finally let himself reach for her hand. The gesture was small, careful, but it carried more weight than any words. She did not pull away. Instead, she squeezed lightly, a confirmation of trust, a recognition of the tremor that had been more than hesitation. It had been the pulse of courage finding its place. Inside the house, the fire crackled, filling the rooms with warmth and the smell of burning wood. They sat close, not speaking at first, letting the storm outside mirror the quiet resolution within. He looked at her, at the calm steadiness that had unsettled and inspired him all at once, and felt the tremor in his hands settle into a rhythm that matched the fire's glow. Gentle was no longer a word to fear. It was a guide, a promise, and a reflection of the man he could be: careful, patient, aware, and willing to give as much as he took. The cattle had been secured earlier, the fences repaired, and the barn doors closed against the wind, but the real work had been inside the house, inside the heart. He realized that the days of isolation, of relying only on routine and self-discipline, had prepared him for this in unexpected ways. The patience he had learned from the land, the careful observation he had applied to animals and storms, now applied to her. He could be strong and careful, confident and gentle, all at once. And in that understanding, the tremor finally quieted. They talked quietly as the storm raged beyond the walls. She asked about his past, about the years he had spent alone, about the mistakes and regrets he had carried. He answered honestly, telling her of loss, of failed trust, of nights spent listening to the wind and wishing for something he had not dared to name. She listened without interruption, without judgment, understanding that gentleness was not only about touch, but about acceptance, about acknowledging every scar and tremor without fear. The air between them softened, carrying the warmth of connection that neither had expected but both had needed. The days that followed were bright and steady. The rain gave way to sun, the fields glistened, and the land seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Together, they moved through chores, shared meals, and explored the routines that had once been solitary. She continued to notice the subtle ways he measured each moment, each gesture, and he began to notice the ways her presence strengthened his careful nature. Trust grew quietly, woven into daily life, into the rhythm of work, into the shared silence that now carried meaning. At the barn, he taught her the fine points of managing the herd, guiding cattle, reading the sky for approaching weather. She followed with patience and precision, yet with her own touch of insight that surprised him more than once. He found himself smiling at the realization that gentleness was not surrender, it was balance. It was the careful negotiation of strength and care, of patience and intention, of fear and courage. And he felt that he could live with it, embrace it, because it did not demand perfection, only presence. Evenings became their quiet sanctuary. They would sit on the porch, watching the horizon change colors as the sun fell, sharing thoughts, dreams, and unspoken feelings. The tremor in his hands, once a signal of fear, had become almost imperceptible, replaced by a rhythm of anticipation and awareness. He could meet her gaze without flinching, could touch with intention, could speak with honesty. The land had shaped him into a man capable of endurance, and now, through her presence, he was learning to endure with compassion, with patience, with care. A few weeks passed, each day a test and a reward. One morning, they rode together across the hills, checking fences, guiding cattle, and simply being present. She laughed at a young calf stumbling through the mud, and he laughed with her, the sound long absent from the ranch. He realized that joy, like gentleness, was a choice, and it could grow even in places hardened by years of labor and solitude. Her trust had become his guide, and the connection between them, quiet and steady, became the center of his life. Conflict still lingered, not in fear or doubt, but in the practicalities of life on the ranch. Storms came and went, fences required repair, cattle needed tending. Yet he faced each challenge with renewed focus, because now he was not alone. She was beside him, patient and capable, and he learned to let her share the load without hesitation. The tremor, once a constant reminder of fear, had transformed into a signal of mindfulness, a way to measure intention and care in every act, every choice. Evenings continued to carry the warmth of connection. They shared quiet meals, discussions about the future, and small plans for the land. She planted flowers near the porch, tended herbs in the kitchen, and quietly made the house feel like a home. He noticed the small details, the way her hands moved with purpose, the way her gaze lingered in thought, and he felt a sense of peace he had never known. It was a peace built not on solitude or avoidance, but on presence, trust, and mutual respect. One night, after a long day of tending the land and moving cattle, he led her to the porch. The sky was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. He took her hands gently in his, and this time the tremor was gone. There was only steadiness, awareness, and the quiet courage to embrace what had been waiting all along. She smiled, a mixture of pride and understanding, and he realized that gentleness had never been about weakness. It had been about choice, about courage, about letting someone see the parts of himself he had once hidden. The ranch, too, seemed to reflect the change. The fields were orderly, the cattle content, the barns secure. Storms still came, but they were met with preparation and teamwork, a shared understanding that strength and care could coexist. The land had always demanded endurance, but now it also bore witness to connection, to trust, and to the quiet joy that arose when two people worked together, balancing independence and closeness, patience and intention. They spoke of the future quietly, about shared dreams, about plans for the ranch, about how they could continue to care for the land and each other. He realized that the tremor he had feared was not a flaw, it was a sign that he was alive, aware, capable of change. Her presence had illuminated what he had hidden even from himself, that gentleness was not a weakness, that connection was not a danger, and that love could be steady, patient, and enduring without diminishing strength. In the final days of the season, The rancher and the woman stood together on the porch, the wind carrying the scent of grass, rain, and earth. They looked out at the fields, the creek, the distant hills, and understood that the life they had built together was one of balance, trust, and courage. He no longer feared the tremor in his hands because he had learned to meet it with awareness and intention. She no longer hesitated to be near him because she had seen his honesty and patience. The story of the wrench of the storm and of the tremor had reached its resolution not in dramatic declarations, but in quiet choices, in shared labor, in steady presence. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and emerged with a connection that was strong, gentle, and enduring. The land continued to demand care, but now it was a shared responsibility, a bond that strengthened both of them. The rancher finally understood that life, like the land, required patience, effort, and attention. But he also understood that trust and connection could transform even the harshest terrain into a place of warmth, hope, and possibility. The tremor had become a symbol, not of fear, but of awareness, a reminder that true gentleness required courage and that love, when given intentionally, could flourish even in places long hardened by solitude. As night fell, they stood together on the porch one last time, the stars reflecting their quiet joy. The storm had passed, both outside and within. The rancher's hands were steady, his heart open, and the woman beside him was calm, confident, and trusting. Together they faced the land, the future, and the quiet beauty of a life shared. Gentle had become more than a word. It had become a way of living, a reflection of courage, patience, and love. And as the wind whispered through the fields, carrying the scent of earth and promise, they knew that they had found something lasting, a home, a partnership, and a happiness earned through trust, care, and the quiet bravery to embrace the unknown.